allow me to weave for you a morality tale. A tale of what would happen if you could see your own soul, witness the degradation of every sin, watch yourself grow old, and suffer the consequences of your bad choices, while suffering none on your own body. And then let me tell you about the philosophical and ethical ramifications of art and its influence on humanity. Oh yeah. The Picture of Dorian Gray is the only published novel by the poet, the famous poet, Oscar Wilde. This book was published in 1890 and was serialized throughout newspapers. The novel version was published in 1891 and subsequently had to go through a lot of censorship because Oscar Wilde, being a flaming bisexual man, wrote in a lot of sexual tension. Basically, every male character sort of has the hots for each other, and it makes for a sort of awkward but also very tense few scenes between these men, as they all have these desires that at the time were considered bizarre and unethical. The book follows a young, handsome, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, perfect Aryan specimen, Dorian Gray, a beautiful young man around 20 years old, who goes in to have a painting of himself made by his best friend Basil Hallward. Basil Hallward is a painter and is utterly infatuated with Dorian. Literally, the homoeroticism drips from the first chapter. Oh, don't mind me. Basil Hallward's friend, Lord Henry, comes along, and he is complimenting the painting. Instantly, we get the sense that Lord Henry is a man who he loves to hear himself talk, and he loves to say these terribly demoralizing things, not because he believes them, but just because he enjoys the shock of telling them to people and their thoughts on it. He is an utterly contrarian spirit from the beginning of the book right to the end. He never changes. He meets Dorian Gray as he's sitting on the last day of the painting's process of being made, and he tells Dorian, you know, you are such a young, handsome man. Make sure you don't waste your youth like most of us do. Go out and live. Do everything. Everything is open to you while you're young. But soon you'll be old and wrinkled and ugly, and then the world will be closed to you. This awakens Dorian's mind to say, oh my gosh, I've got to do something now while I'm young. And he sees the painting, and he's overwhelmed with despair that the painting will forever remain the age that it was at that particular day. Oh, if only it was the other way around. I would give anything if the painting could grow old and I could stay young. For that, I would give my very soul. And we don't get any indication of direct supernatural influence besides that line, but it's enough that most people who talk about this book online tend to say, it's a Faustian pact with the devil. Well, the book never says that. Sure, it implies that, but I think it would be missing the wider point of the novel to only focus it in on a deal with the devil, as some versions in film do. This book was as much about the influence of art on life and the influence of life on art in a perfect cycle as it was a morality tale. In fact, Wilde himself was a part of the aestheticism movement, which basically means art has no purpose except pleasure. The best art is the art that provides the maximal amount of pleasure to the viewer, reader, etc. Now, you can see that influence because Dorian Gray is a beautifully written book. It's much like all of the books, if you've ever read any of Vladimir Nabokov, where the books are all kind of written, they're written in prose, but there's a rhythm to them like poetry. It's a lot like that. Masterful novel, and there's just paragraphs and paragraphs just describing flowers. It's a very short book, but there is a lot of stuff just describing the beautiful in the mundane of every day and the pleasure that it gives. I particularly like one line where Dorian and Basil are talking, and Dorian talks about the feeling of ivory in his hands. It's a wonderful paragraph. So Dorian goes out and he decides to indulge in the most narcissistic of pleasures. He goes into the East End, which is basically the slum area of London, and he indulges in all of these drugs and stuff. He sleeps with prostitutes. But before he can get to that point, he meets an actress who is playing Juliet on a stage in this rundown old theater. He falls instantly in love with her, and he comes back to Harry and is like, "Why didn't you tell me the only thing in the world worth loving was an actress?" And Harry's like, "Well, because I've loved so many of them, dear boy." But when they go to see her, they find that she is a terrible actress. And when Dorian goes backstage to confront her, "I loved you, we were going to get married, and because you were this great actress, and now, look at you, you're a second-rate actress with a pretty face." And she's like, "But Dorian, don't you understand? I only could play Juliet because acting was my life. But now I know the reality of love. It would be sacrilege to pretend to be in love." And then, of course, because he's an incredibly shallow person, Dorian says, "I hate you now. Your art is terrible, so you're terrible, and I can't love you anymore," and he leaves. Sybil Vane, unbeknownst to Dorian, is so distraught by this that she kills herself by drinking poison. In the same way Romeo did. So we see already in just the first half of the book, not even half yet, about a third of the book, that cycle. The art inspires Dorian to love her. The art brings them together, Romeo and Juliet in real life. And then the lack of the art, real life, separates them, just as Romeo and Juliet. And in her effort to regain control, she commits suicide just as her Juliet did. In fact, Dorian comments on it, that her final performance was to become Juliet. So you see how it cycles all around. So Dorian notices the first change in the painting. The painting is now scowling. It knows that he's been cruel to Sybil Vane. So he writes her a letter saying, "Please forgive me and I'll marry you. I'm sorry that all this happened." But oh no! Lord Henry comes by the next morning to tell him it's too late. Sybil Vane has killed herself. But luckily for Dorian, nobody at the theater knew his real name. Sybil Vane would only ever call him Prince Charming. See how she's taken art, a fairy tale, a story, and turned it into real life. In a brief but really great and powerful scene, Basil Hallward actually admits to Dorian that he is in love with him. Now this was one of the scenes that was really trimmed down so that it's more about his obsession with him as an artist and his desire to capture the perfection that he found in Dorian. So it's more that he admires him too much rather than that he's in love with him. But in the original, it was far more explicit that Basil had a little crush on old Dorian Gray. Dorian hides the painting away in his attic, in the schoolroom. Very poignant place. The place where he spent his boyhood is now the place where his soul will rot in his adulthood. Dorian spends 19 long years committing every form of debauchery possible. During this 20-year period, we're also told that Dorian is given a book by Lord Henry. And this book speeds up Dorian's descent into complete and utter debauchery. The book is kept vague and we're never told the title, but we get an idea that it is about a supreme narcissist, somebody who lives the perfectly hedonistic lifestyle, and Dorian begins to model his life after this man, even buying the book and rebinding it in different colors so that he can have a book color for every occasion. In fact, basically the implication, I think, is that this book is sort of becoming Dorian's Bible. Basically, everything that this terribly hedonistic person does, Dorian wants to do too. Now, the reason why it's so important, the reason I mention this, is because that yellow-bound book was meant to represent French literature. French novels in the Victorian era were often bound with yellow book covers to show that they were of a scandalous nature. And so this, I think, was meant in some way to symbolize the degradation of English art and English literature by the influence of people like the French, who were adding in this moral chaos. Now, it's funny, of course, because if you have that point of view on this sort of thing, you have to balance it out by remembering that Oscar Wilde didn't think art was meant to have a moral purpose. So I think his tongue was planted firmly in his cheek when he wrote this book, where art is having moral effects on humanity, and yet he himself, as an aestheticist, didn't believe that it did. He indulges in all these drugs and vices in his cruelty, his increasing cruelty and desire to just kind of know what would happen if he did things. He destroys the lives of everyone who knows him, whether it's encouraging them to do things like forge a check, even down to the smallest things. There's even the implication in a later part where that he might have slept with or raped a young boy who grew up to be the man who would save him in his adulthood from being hanged for murder. There is an implication in the way they talk that not only was there a sexual relationship between them, but that Alan didn't fully understand the consequences of what he was doing. I can't really exactly put it into words, but you just have to kind of see it to understand what I'm talking about. So just read the book. Come on, just go read the book, guys. Basil comes by on Dorian's 39th birthday to tell him, bro, listen, everybody's talking about you. Everybody knows that you are poison. You are social poison to everybody who knows you. But when I see you, I can't believe it because, the sins that a man commits, they write themselves across a man's face. And you're beautiful. You look like you're still 20 years old. How is that possible? And Dorian finally takes Basil upstairs after Basil says, to know the truth about you, I'd have to see your soul, but only God can do that. And Dorian is like, oh yeah? Come have a look at this. Shows him the painting, and as Basil is kind of freaking out about it, he drops to his knees and starts praying. Dorian, pray with me. The prayer of your pride was answered. The prayer of your repentance may be answered too. It's never too late. Pray with me. What was it that we used to say in our boyhood? What was taught to us? Forgive us our sins and save us from temptation. And he's unable to take the mounting guilt on both sides of him. The painting in art form convicting him of his sins, and his best friend on the other side, who finally has seen his soul. Now he's dealing with the real-life consequences of the art, and Dorian inevitably must destroy one or the other, so he kills Basil Hallward. Next, he brings Alan Campbell to his house and blackmails him into destroying the body of Basil Hallward. He does this because Alan is a chemist. So then Dorian is confronted in the street by Sybil Vane's brother. After 20 years, he finally found him, with nothing to go off of but the nickname Prince Charming. He finally finds him. He's ready to kill Dorian, but Dorian's like, hey man, take me into the light and look at me. Do you think I'm really old enough to have done that? So James lets him go, but then James is told by other people, hey, Dorian Gray's looked 20 for the last 19 years, bro. So you need to you should have killed him. So he pursues Dorian to his country estate. And while there, all of the men, the lords, Lord Henry and Dorian and all of them, are hunting. And accidentally, during the hunt, James Vane is shot and killed. So Dorian has now roundaboutly murdered James. He almost directly murdered Sybil by driving her to suicide, and he did directly murder Basil Hallward. And after the murder of Basil, he notices that the painting now has blood on its hands. A great, great visual. He finally tells Harry in the penultimate chapters of the book, listen, I want to be good. I was dating this girl out in the country, and she was beautiful, but she was this innocent country girl, and you know what? I didn't touch her. I didn't defile her or deflower her as I've done so many. I let her have her innocence. I left her alone, and that might be the first thing I've ever done that was actually good in my life. And Lord Henry scoffs at him and says, man, Dorian, this is all your pride. Look at this. All you've done is ensure she's never going to be happy now that she has to go and marry some old farmhand when she could have had you, a lord, living in the city in London. And Dorian realizes this is right, and he goes back to see his painting, and somehow it is a little bit worse. He realizes Lord Henry is right. It was actually all about his pride. So realizing that he can never be free while the painting exists, he takes the knife that killed Basil Hallward. As it destroyed the artist, so shall it destroy the art. He stabs the painting through the chest, and his servants hear a cry downstairs. They come upstairs, bust down the door, and when they come in, they find a withered old man on the floor with a knife stuck in his chest. And sitting against the wall, the beautiful painting by Basil Hallward, as gorgeous as it was the day it was painted. And it wasn't until they checked the rings on his hands that they realized the old man was Dorian Gray. This is, I think, one of the greatest works of literature ever written. It is my second favorite book, and I read it once every couple years. I never stray too far from it. And so, although I know we said we'd be getting into some Halloween stuff, and we will, Dorian Gray has moments of horror. And although it's not, strictly speaking, a horror story, it is a gothic story. The horror of the soul, and what is commonly called body horror. Watching yourself decay into a living corpse before your eyes, knowing that that is the real you. There's some great versions that use that body horror to tremendous effect in the way they present the painting. But there's also the degradation of the soul, which we talked about in our last video. The supernatural horror, I think, it is my personal belief, it comes back around so much because deep down we all have a sense that evil is objective, that it doesn't go anywhere. You know, the evil is real. It's a foundational existence that transcends this world. And I think that focusing on the evil inside of you, but not in a psychological sense, but rather in a spiritual sense, how your soul, your very soul, can decay, is, I think, a unique thing in horror that we don't see a lot of. So again, although it's not strictly speaking a horror novel, it is something that I feel has good elements of horror, and we're going to look at some versions that are pretty much horror movies. This was just to kind of get our toes wet and come to a place where we can discuss this with some education about whether or not an adaptation is a good adaptation. And remembering, of course, that a good adaptation does not necessarily mean a good movie, and a bad adaptation does not necessarily mean a bad movie. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe so that you can stay up to date. And if you really want to actually get notified, then hit the little subscribe bell. And thank you everybody for watching this video. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.